introduction than I can of John. But
Definitely not.
just a couple of other things. Obviously, a couple of people probably know this already. Been on other calls, but obviously people are working home, so things might kids might pop on the screen, pets. We might have fire alarms going off. People pop into the door, so don't feel it, things happen on these calls. Um, but I'll just hand it over to John now, and John's going to take us through the session, and feel free to get involved in the session as well.
Perfect. I tell you what, I couldn't do any better myself, Connor, to be honest, in terms of an introduction. That's to be fair, with the number of sessions you've done today as well, that is very compliments to you and Lauren for putting all this together. You've done a sterling job, and hopefully I'll be able to kind of keep the energy level going in this last one. I'll just throw the slides up on screen for you, as kind of alluded to, really. It says workshop on there. I see these being very much more a conversation and a discussion point, more than anything else, really. It's trying to, I suppose, bring out some thoughts from you. So it is quite an interactive workshop in that respect. But what I want to really try and do is just have a conversation with you around where you see certain things in terms of talent identification, more generally speaking, and then where we can look at that in relation to some of the para or disability football settings that we have. I suppose just to give you a very quick sort of brief background add on to what Connor's already provided so far. I've been involved in and around the talent pathway now for 11, 12 years across various different guises in terms of certainly the way that the pathway is structured, some of the roles that I've had within there as well as a coach, and certainly at the top end of the game, I've been working with England squads now for 9 years. It doesn't seem that long, but 9 years. I'm currently working with the England partially sighted squad as the team manager there, but I've been involved previously with that with the cerebral palsy team leading in towards the Rio Paralympic cycle in 2016. I was with them for 4 seasons, and the first squad I worked with was the learning disability group that we had, and I, again, was with them for 3 seasons. And I've been to various different competitions and alike, and that's all great experience. But that's just my experience, and I'm really interested and keen to learn and hear your thoughts around what the pathway currently looks like, some of the considerations that go into that, and also what that then means for us as we're moving through the pathway towards certainly the England setups, but equally some of the levels we have lower down where there might be opportunities for not only players to get involved, but also from a coaching perspective as well, to have a look and see what that looks like on a practical level when those sessions are able to be delivered again, hopefully in 2021. So this, again, as I say, these are termed outcomes, but these are just more, again, sort of discussion points really to kind of run through. And there's a lot on there. But what we're really trying to do is generate some thoughts, some discussion around various different aspects relating to talent identification, as well as then looking at some of the considerations that are very specific to the disability and the para football pathway. So you'll notice this on there. There's some bits around eligibility and classification. We'll go over some of the various formats of the game that we have as well. And I've got quite a few video clips within the presentation, because I think it's really helpful to look at players and look at the standards of where the England squads are, for instance, to give you a feel for what it looks like at the top level, but equally lower down the pathway as well. One of the big challenges that we have is probably the perceptions around where disability football, para football sits in the wider game consciousness. We tend to always think that when we talk around disabled people and impairment specific provision, it always relates back to something whereby we're considering things like the wheelchair image, because it's the common symbol for disability. We're also considering that we're focusing more upon what the restrictions might be in terms of how the impairment affects the individual, as opposed to really championing and thinking around what these athletes can do rather than focusing on what they can't do. And working with England players is the same as working with grassroots players. we have the same considerations in the respect that it's around confidence building more than anything else, especially when players have been told in the past, you're not good enough for this, you shouldn't be doing this because it's not good for your health, it's going to exacerbate your condition. And these are real challenges for all of us as we kind of move forward, really. So to start off with, I'm going to give you some idea around the 2 squads in particular, and 2 squads that I've kind of worked with most recently. In terms of the cerebral palsy, and firstly with the partially sighted team. So what I've done, I've clipped together some of the best bits from the partially sighted squad, because everyone likes to see the best bits. But I have got some bits in there as well, which highlight some bits where there are other international teams, certainly on the cerebral palsy side, to give you a feel for what the game looks like at the top level. So the first one we'll start off with is the partially sighted team. So we had the World Championships last December, which seems like a very, very long time ago now, where we came in silver medal position, losing to Ukraine in the final. What I've got here is, again, just as I say, a series of compilation of clips around some of the goals that we scored in that competition, so you can see the levels in terms of how the players currently act at, and then I'll show you the cerebral palsy one, and then we'll kind of pick up the conversation from there. So, partially So just a bit of a feel and a bit of a flavour for the partially sighted squad. So probably one of the things you might recognise straight away is the speed of the game compared to what you may anticipate it possibly of looking like prior to seeing that footage. As I say, those are the best bits. By no means were we absolutely flawless in that competition, but you can certainly see with some of the movement and the build-up that some of the players have very different sight levels in that respect, and we'll touch upon more of the classification and eligibility side sort of later on. Just to kind of give you a bit of a feel from a different squad, different impairment. So this is the cerebral palsy team. Again, this is from their World Championships, which took place last year in Spain as well. So again, have a look and see what you think of these.
Come, out you go! Come, edge of the ball!
Always end on a positive with an England goal. Always. So again, you've probably seen some things in there, but remember, again, this is senior level, England top level, in terms of the players that we're working with, and also some of the configurations and complexities around the impairment groups that we're working with. So that just gives you some perspective of what the games look like at the top level. They're very quick, they're very frantic, there's a lot of physicality involved with it. Technical and tactical detail is quite high, but we don't necessarily expect that for obviously players coming through the pathway. In terms of the pathway itself, this is what it currently looks like. Well, it's been in place now since 2017. It might well go through to next year, but possibly even a year after because of the COVID situation that we're currently in. But the talent pathway itself has been through various sort of different iterations, and Connor's been involved with me on quite a few of these in the last few years, in various different capacities as well. What we're trying to offer really is a comparable pathway to what you'd find for boys and girls coming through in non-disability, non-para football provision. So if you ask anyone what they know about the boys and the girls games at the lower level, they'll invariably say that there is some form of identification process, there is some form of academy system, which then allows players to be able to move through that particular pathway to move into the development squads and then the first team groups at a particular club. What we're trying to do with the Football Association is a very similar kind of thing. So what we have on here is the current representation of that pathway. With at the bottom, we have what are called England Talent Days. Now, these are the initial sort of entry routes, really, for players to be identified as potentially ones who could access the pathway and maybe move further on up. Now, these are for 5 to 16-year-olds. Invariably, the way that these generally work is they're an open application process for players or nominations from coaches or parents for players to come along on the day, have an opportunity over the course of a couple or 3 hours to play some games, hear from someone like Steve Daly, someone like Matt Crossan, someone like Dan English, current England squad captains, hear what their experiences are, and then be provided with opportunity following on from the England Talent Day to a referral process, which might involve moving into the talent pathway. It might involve playing more regularly at a club if they're not involved at a club at the moment, or it might be around adding to the current opportunities that they're already involved with additional sessions at other clubs. Now, the England Talent Days, generally speaking, are run through the county FAs, as well as some other sort of local partners, the likes of professional football clubs. But they're the first sort of point of call, really, for players to come into the pathway. Now, the level up from there are what we call talent hubs. These operate on a very localized basis. They have 12 sessions in the year for 7 to 16-year-olds. And again, the intention behind it is to offer an additional opportunity for players to come onto the pathway, get a little bit more additional training for certain, but also allow us to be able to keep a regular monitor on those players to see how they're progressing and how we can support them within their own club environments. So it's an additional opportunity rather than a specific standalone opportunity for players across the season. Up from there, you then have the regional Immersion talent program and then the national programs of the same inflection. The idea behind these is that we take essentially those who we feel are strongest from the likes of the Talent Hub program into the regional program, the strongest from the regional program into the national programs, and then at the top level we then have the under-21 squads, and of course the senior groups sit above the under-21s on that model as well. In terms of the impairment groups, they're open effectively to all impairment groups, and the configuration about how they work is slightly nuanced based upon the impairment provision associated with the game format. So, for example, England Talent Days, with power chair footballers, for instance, we operate separate England Talent Days specifically for wheelchair, power chair players because of the game variation and format and the considerations that go into how we manage the process for them around facilities, for instance, so operating on a hard surface rather than a 3G or a grass surface. We then have the opportunity for players within talent hubs and regional programs where they're more impairment specific mixed. So you're looking at a combination of the likes of cerebral palsy, deaf players, partially sighted players, taking part on pan disability regional Immersion talent programs. But again, we have specific programs for power chair. The blind program have just started to try and operate some more individual based sessions on a regional level to be able to support players in that particular guise. But what we're trying to offer really is an opportunity for every player, regardless of what impairment group they come from, that have a recognised international pathway in terms of an England squad where they can actually go and play at an England level to be able to fit into the current pathway. On the left-hand side, it says other football. Now, what that's meant to indicate is quite a simplistic statement, but is very difficult to then probably put into practice. So other football could be, for instance, playing in mainstream football. It could be playing in pan disability football. It could be playing in impairment-specific football. So, for instance, you might have a player, of which we have a number who are involved in the talent pathway at the moment, who currently play for a mainstream club, so a non-disability club, go for training and competition, and they also play for an impairment-specific club as well. So they get an opportunity to train in their local environment with the grassroots club, and then they have the opportunity to practice and learn within their game-specific impairment format. So, for instance, in cerebral palsy football, we play 7v7, so we look to try and support players into learning how 7v7 works from a tactical point of view, from a technical point of view, and also bearing in mind the considerations that players have on an individual level. Players can fit in at any stage of the pathways. This is not a linear process, i.e. you have to go from England Talent Day and then go Talent Hub, Regional, National, Under-21s, Senior. Players can and have moved into the pathway at all levels, at all times. So, for instance...
Sorry, John, just when you're on that point, we had a question today from one of our participants.
Yep.
Who was at a certain age, so they're obviously an older age, so they're like 24, 25.
Yep.
What is the process for them in terms of, say, if a club, say a mainstream club sees them, and obviously they wouldn't fit into this pathway?
Yeah, no, of course. So that's the example I'm just coming on to with Matt Crossan. So Matt Crossan, for instance, who's the current England cerebral palsy captain, who was the goal scorer in the last clip that you saw, where he's gone past the post and then flicked it back with his right foot. Matt's the current England CP captain. Matt came into us at the age of 22. He'd had a stroke, represents symptoms and outputs that are very comparable to what the examination processes are in terms of classification for cerebral palsy players. Matt played at a mainstream club up in Middlesbrough. And the pathway for him was that he came to find out about the opportunities that exist because he saw what was going on with the Paralympics. So he came into to join the squad in 2014, having seen what had happened in London in 2012, and then getting involved sort of after the initial competition that we had in 2013. So for players who fit in above the age groups that are shown on here, there is still an opportunity for them to be referred into the local scouting network, which invariably involves initially a nomination or an approach to the county FA to kind of say, I'd like to have an opportunity to be scouted or watched from a point of view of maybe England, but certainly for the point of view of seeing where I might fit into the pathway. Once we've got that nomination that comes in, it then goes into our talent team, who I'll kind of outline a little bit more who they are in a moment. They then refer it down to the local scouting network. So, for instance, I look after a lot of the London and South East region. And then we then go and watch players in their own environment with their club to be able to see and also then be able to support them with the next step after that observation as well, most importantly. So there's always three outcomes that come from any observation, whether we do it on a nomination, so it might be like with the older player from a scouting perspective, or whether it's on something like an England Talent Day. If they're not playing at a club at the moment, we look to support them into a club so they can continue playing football alongside the county FA databases of affiliated clubs. If they're already involved in some form of football activity, we will then look to see whether they are happy and comfortable in that environment and whether they're being challenged. And if they are, then great, but there might be some additional opportunities we can offer to them which might support what they're doing with their club. And then it's then about working with their grassroots club to support that organisation alongside any additional opportunities we can signpost players to. And then the third is continue playing in your local club and access the talent pathway through maybe one of the strands you've got on here. So a talent hub, a regional or a national programme, or maybe even going straight in at the England level if you're already at that particular technical and tactical level, as well as physically speaking, able to cope with that particular environment as well. So essentially there is a lot of different ways that people can come into and be involved in the pathway. and they don't necessarily have to follow that linear pathway that you can see on the screen there. It is very much, you can come in at any point from any environment, and if you want to have an opportunity to come in and you're under 16 years old, this is one option. If you're over 16 years old, speak to the county FA. They can then get in touch with the talent team, and then from there we can come and watch the player in their own environment and continue to support them in their local club setting. And that goes across the various impairment formats that you can see on the screen there. Just for clarity before I kind of move on, at the senior levels, we have squads operating for all these groups, so blind, cerebral palsy, deaf male, deaf female, partially sighted and power chair. With the amputee setup, it's a referral process. So the England Amputee Football Association operate a representative England and Great Britain side. So what we still do is we still support them with their talent identification process, and then signpost players to their local opportunities, and then I suppose their national programs, so they can continue moving forwards into representing England or GB and amputee football as well. And then as we start to come down the process, then there might be some more nuanced bits around blind and power chair, for instance, but invariably what you find is that cerebral palsy, deaf and partially sighted, generally speaking, work on a pan disability sort of process to allow players to be able to come into the pathway, and then they start to move towards their impairment specific format at the higher end of that pathway rather than the lower end, where it starts to become more pertinent, looking at things like classification, eligibility, and also understanding the game format in that respect as well. Hopefully that answers the question for you, Connor, from before. Yeah. So just to kind of help with giving some additional information in relation to what the talent team actually looks like, for how we refer, how we support. So we've got James Watkins, who sits at the top of that particular diagram. He's the National Talent Pathway Manager for the Football Association. And then underneath him, he looks after, admittedly, a very small team in terms of the talent pathway. So Lauren's recently come in as the National Talent Identification Lead. Will Perkins has been in post for 5-6 years now as the confirmation lead. So the identification lead would look after, for instance, things like the England Talent Day programme and the Talent Hub programmes, to the lower end of the previous slide. Will looks after, in his confirmation role, more the regional and then the national emerging talent programmes. So there's a very clear distinction between identifying players in the initial instance and then what we then call confirming, i.e. bringing them into more substantial programmes moving forwards. And then the final person on that slide is then Paul Harrison, who is our player lifestyle lead. So he looks after, for instance, supporting players on individual levels as well as collective levels with a variety of different considerations. So some might be around bringing players in for guest appearances and guest speaking sessions, but equally he will then look at supporting individuals who are in the pathway to be able to access educational opportunities, additional funding sources, so through the likes of the TAS scheme, where we're looking at talented athletes and the support processes that might allow them to be able to gain additional opportunities through funding to not only support what they do in terms of the talent pathway, but also what they do around accessing gym facilities, for instance, locally to them as well. So these are the people who those referrals will come into, whether it's from an under-16 perspective or whether it's an external application that comes in via the county FA. So invariably, most of the initial kind of flow of information comes into Lauren as the identification lead, and then it then moves on to Will, and potentially then on to James, and also the national performance manager who looks after the elite squads, depending on where the player needs to fit into. So there are people in the system who can support and help those who are referred in to know where to go and what to do and how they can then move forward from that particular point that they are on their journey in respect of the talent pathway. Any questions on that so far, or are we okay?
No, we're okay. Well, I'm okay.
Okay, so just, it says groups, but again, as I say, we're going to keep this quite informal and quite discursive. So any suggestions on how we would define talented and potential? Because they're two very different terms in some ways, but with some possible crossover in others. How would we potentially go about defining talent and potential? Any thoughts or suggestions? How would we define that? Antonio, so talent, something that you have from birth. Do you want to offer anything for potential as well to go alongside that? Here we go. So something that can help you grow. Interesting. Any other thoughts around how we might define talent or talented and potential? What do we think?
It kind of depends where the player is at that certain time you work with them.
Okay.
So obviously somebody who has been coached in a certain way might be at that level, might be ahead of somebody, but who maybe hasn't had that coaching, but might have the potential to reach that.
Yep.
Given the right advice.
Okay. So that's certainly potentially something else. Okay, we got Antonio's sent another one in. Talent is more about technical skills, and maybe potential is about the whole player. So these are a couple of definitions that we would suggest or offer as potentially ways that we might define these particular terms. So talented is looking at academic literature, which takes it from a wider spectrum than just simply football or disability, but across a variety of different sports. Talent is suggested as being that mastery of some form of ability or competency that puts the individual inside the top 10% bracket of their particular field. So you are someone who sits in the highest echelons of your chosen field. So for instance, if you think about football players, that might be around the level that they play at in terms of a competition, for instance. So if you consider the Premier League, those players would be considered talented. If you consider teams who maybe play in step 7, that might be more towards a non-talented environment because they don't sit within the top 10% of the athletes taking part within that particular field. On the other hand, potential is around what we would look at in terms of latent qualities or abilities that can be developed and might then lead towards some form of either usefulness or potentially future success in that respect. So potential is having the possible qualities that maybe need to be drawn out. So something like Antonio suggested where it can, you're looking to try and help someone grow, to bring those qualities, those characteristics, those traits a bit more to the fore. Whereas talent is where now these are consistently recognized as being particular attributes that come out that relate to the player maybe in the highest level of the game, competing in an environment where they are definitely considered to be one of the top 10%. So it's important to recognize when we're talking around talent and potential, talented is certainly going to be probably the England setups. What we're looking at more often than not within the talent pathway is around potential and trying to work out in as best a way as we possibly can do, what factors may come into the consideration for us to maybe help this individual achieve what they might aspire to in the game, which might be going on and moving up the pathway towards the England level. So just on that again, just something for you to kind of throw into, and again, consider it not necessarily maybe from a disability or a para-football perspective, but just think around and see if you can offer some thoughts, some ideas, some suggestions. What might be some potential factors or potential ways or potential considerations that would help us to assess or evaluate potential or talent in an individual? So what would we look at in terms of trying to identify someone who might have talent or might have potential? What do we reckon? What might be some of the considerations?
Something like their attitude towards kind of the game and maybe outside they're kind of away from the game as well, what their attitude is to success or they've got the drive to do.
Yes, attitude could certainly be one. So what are they like on and off the field of play? Do they demonstrate similar qualities? Do they have a positive or growth mindset, which is now kind of the sort of the buzz phrase really, but do they have an attitude which really puts them forwards? Antonio, another one. If we create a safe...
Understanding of what they need to do.
Yep, so potentially might relate into understanding. So the understanding of the game, the understanding of technical aspects relating into the game as well, definitely. We might look at, so Antonio suggested confidence. So that's a really good one that links into the attitude side. So whether or not they're confident in their own ability, how anxious are they? Can they deal with pressure? Do they know how to deal with pressure? Anything else we can think of that might potentially impact around how and when we might identify players?
Socially as well, are they like a leader within the team? Are they going to be somebody who's going to maybe support other players within the team?
Yep, so we might be looking at some leadership qualities within there. Do they have a natural ability to be able to lead players on? Can they be socially quite cohesive with those around them, or do they have problems developing relationships with people? Good. Anything else that we can think of that might help in terms of determining when someone might fit into a particular area on that pathway? So yeah, Antonio's got another one, to starting from the strong side and developing the weak side.
Supportive family. What about supportive family or something like that? You know, support.
Yeah. Good. So we might have a look at the background to the individual. So what the family's like, what the peer group around them is like. So their friendship group, what they're like at school, potentially as well. Good. So we're starting to build up some ideas in terms of what might come into the mix as far as looking at a player is concerned and trying to work out where they sit in the system. Now, I've got another clip for you. So this is a young player who is admittedly in our system at the moment. Just want you to have a watch of him as he's playing. And just as you're watching it, note down what you see, things that you think he can do, things that you think he can't. Will is a deaf player, a profoundly deaf player. So just to give you some context on that, what are some of the things that you see that he does in the clip? And think around it in relation to assessing whether he's talented or has potential. So as you're watching it, just take some notes and thoughts around what you see. So Will's that one in the red in the middle of the screen now on the ball. Number 10 on his jersey. So, what did you see?
But he's got everything, hasn't he?
Go on then, talk to me about
he's got
things that you've seen.
He's got agility, he's got speed, he's got ball control, he's got awareness of space, not only his space, but other players' space. He's always looking around, always looking to see where people are, where he should be, where the ball is.
So what in particular stands out for you? What would you consider to be potentially his strength, his super strength from what you've seen? Do you think it's his technical ability? Do you think it's his tactical ability? Do you think it's his social side? What do you reckon?
I think it's his tactical side. It's difficult to see in that little clip, but just looking at that, I think it's his tactical side. Okay.
Antonio's jumped in on this one as well. So suggested around looking at approaching the pitch with a wide view. So if you were to see this player playing in a grassroots environment, so considering that deaf players, generally speaking, play mainstream football. Predominantly, they might also play some deaf specific provision as well, but invariably they'll play mainstream football as well. Where would you suggest that player sits in the pathway? Do you think he's good enough for a boys' academy? Do you think he's not? Do you think he's got some talent in that respect? Where would you pitch him, do you think?
I definitely pitch him in a boys' academy, but it's very difficult to tell. But I mean, yeah, I definitely on just that look, I think he's extremely talented and should be in an academy.
So Will, ironically enough, is actually in an academy program in a mainstream professional football club.
Yeah, I could see
Now,
that.
yeah, so he is one who came into us, and this goes back onto the question you asked earlier on, Connor, where he got a referral in from his club because they recognised that he had an impairment because he was wearing cochlear implants, and they wanted to find out more about the opportunity that may exist for him outside of what he does with his club, because as we all know, not every player who's in an academy goes on to make it as a professional. And equally within our talent pathway, not every player who comes into the pathway will necessarily go on to become an England international. But the key thing is helping those players to recognise where they can be supported at particular stages on the journey to maybe help them with their aspiration of getting there, but certainly allowing them to continue their involvement and their enjoyment within the game. So Will, for instance, has a lot of considerations on here, and some of which we started to touch upon really. So we spoke, for instance, around parent relationships. We've spoken around what happens in terms of peer groups. We've also had a look at the attitude side, as you alluded to there, Connor, so what we would call the coachability. Does the player take on information? Are they quite reserved? Do they engage with that, or are they quite away from it? But there are a lot of other things that potentially we need to think around. So one is around eligibility and classification, which we're going to move on to next. So is he eligible for playing in the deaf pathway, for instance? Because that's another consideration for us. We don't want to bring players onto the pathway, build their hopes up, and then have to let them down at the last minute. It's much better, certainly in my experience where I've been through this, to be open and honest around what the opportunities are and then what the opportunities also are not as well. Because you don't want to bring a player in and then start trying to take them through and then have to let them down later on. And aligned to that, you then also got to consider, what does the pathway look like? Does the condition deteriorate? So especially if you're looking at someone who has like a visual impairment, for instance, they might have a degenerative condition. So they might start out as someone who has what would be a B2 or a B3 classification. So they might have some sight or shadow perception or light perception, but then their condition means that over time, they're going to drop down to be eligible for blind football, and the game format is going to change for them. So do we wait to the point where they become a blind footballer, or can we get them involved in partially sighted and start that integration process? So when they reach that point, they've had a long time being involved, being supported, and know what the game format's going to be like. The other one I want to kind of bring to your attention really is that one at the very, very bottom. And this goes back to what I mentioned initially on that talent pathway slide. These are what we would call dual pathway opportunities. So where we talk about dual pathway, in this instance, what we're talking about here is an opportunity to potentially play mainstream football or futsal, but also being able to play within the disability or the para pathway as well. So players can play in both pathways. They are not exclusive to each other from a disability perspective. It is exclusive if you go the other way. You don't have an impairment and you want to play in para football because you need to have an impairment. But if you have an impairment, you can play and are encouraged to play, certainly as you move into the higher levels of the pathway in terms of the national programs and the international squads, to play in the highest level of football that you can and that you feel comfortable with playing in as well. So there's this big consideration around how do we develop players within the environment, but also how do we support them in that respect as well? Because a lot of these kids who come to us in the younger age groups, and also potentially if they've come through instances in adulthood where they might have acquired their impairment, have a lot of psychological trauma potentially associated with them. Now that might be because if they've acquired their impairment, it's a sudden life-changing event. If they are born with their impairment, it might be that they were excluded in school from being able to take part in activities because either the teacher didn't have confidence or didn't have the provision to be able to integrate them into activities, or it was something whereby it was not seen as being supportive to their wider health So we have all these various factors we need to think around, and it isn't always necessary that what we see is the true case with the player. And that's why Paul Harrison in his lifestyle lead role is really important for us to help with getting underneath the cover a little bit of the player, to really understand them, get to know them, and then recognize what specific support they may need in that respect. So as you can see, wide variety of factors on there. So that top one that's shown on there around the eligibility, the classification, the impairment pathway, these are slightly different depending upon which impairment group you're looking at. So by way of example, these are ones where there are recognized England or representative pathways into international competition, currently either through the Football Association or through other organizations. Now, eligibility and classification is a real minefield, and I've spent many nights when I've been away on international competitions. We have normally a classification period that leads into the competition itself, and invariably at classification, there are always players who get classification groupings changed, and sometimes there have been players who have been classified out, and we've had to go to appeal. And even for myself and certainly the medical professionals who look at this on a regular basis, even we sometimes find this a very difficult and challenging world, because it's really difficult to know who's where and when, how, based upon the criteria. The key message for me, looking at what's on here, and we'll go through these a little bit more, is that you do not need to be an expert in classification. You do not need to be an expert in eligibility. What it is important to do is to recognise what the qualities are that a player has, and to recognise what potential impairment group they may fall into. So, amputee footballers, for instance, you might see a fantastic amputee footballer who has, for instance, either an amputated arm or restricted growth in that sense, so they might have a stump. They can only play at the international level as a goalkeeper. They cannot play out on field. Outfield players have to be below knee, single leg amputees and use aluminium crutches. So that's the restrictions that we're working with them. So if you see a fantastic player who has both legs and one arm, and they want to play outfield, then naturally the opportunities for them to be able to play internationally are restricted. So therefore, it's about managing the expectation around what they can and can't do. Similarly, with blind players, so we have what's called B1, B2, B3, and B4. So if you look at the partially sighted one at the same time. With visual impairments, this is based upon ophthalmology tests. So you'll go to the opticians, to an ophthalmologist, and they will conduct sight tests based upon field and acuity, and the scores from that then relate to particular classification groupings. So if you fall below a certain level, then you'll be classified as B1. If you are above that level, then you'll be B2. If you're slightly above that, you'll be B3. If you're above that, you might be B4. And then if you're above that, you then wouldn't be eligible in that respect. Now, again, you do not need to know whether a player is B1, B2, B3, or B4. Absolutely not. What it is helpful to know is whether the player has a visual impairment, and to know what that visual impairment is as well. So what the potential condition is that might be resulting in their reduced level of sight, because that can give us some clues and some indicators as to whether or not players might be a B2 or a B3, for instance, which are really comparable groups in terms of sight level. In terms of cerebral palsy, there are 3 classification groups to this, what we would call FT1, FT2, and FT3. You might still see some of the terms banded around, which are FT5, 6, 7, and 8. If you see those, you can disregard them, but that's the old classification system that we used to have in cerebral palsy football. To give you an example of an FT1 CP footballer, we've got the example here of Jack Fox. So Jack is an FT1 footballer. So FT1 is at the most impaired end of the spectrum, and FT3, who's Joel, who I'll show you next, is the most minimally impaired. So this is Jack Fox. So Jack is the yellow bib in the middle of your screen there. He is what would be classified as an FT1 CP footballer. So I'll talk you through, as we're watching this, what you'll see with FT1 footballers is that they might have a very pronounced limb hold or stiffness. So especially as a player fatigues, that will become more pronounced. You can see that on his left side, that he's holding his arm when he goes into a running motion. It's slightly stiffer, slightly less free than the right-hand side. He's playing off his right foot because he's a left-sided hemiplegic player, so he's affected just on the one side. What you might also see with an FT1 is that in the lower limbs, so on the foot in particular, you'll notice that there might not be a heel strike. So if you think about when you are walking, invariably you'll go heel first, then flat foot, and then push off the toe, and then the foot goes up and it comes back down again. With a CP player, especially an FT1, for instance, what you'll find is that there is no heel strike. They will go tiptoe, and then the foot will come down that way. So rather than it being in that plane, it's like that. It's the opposite way. And that's simply because of the way that the stiffness inside of the muscle, so the spasticity, the rigidity, the flexibility of the muscle is reduced because CP affects is a condition which affects the tendons and the muscle strength. So what you're now seeing with Jack is, as he's more fatigued, that left arm is much more loosely pronounced, and you're starting to see more of a heel strike disappearing on that left-hand side. But on his right side, he's unaffected, so he continues playing in the same way that you would expect of any player in that respect. So that's what an FT1 would look like. For an FT3, so this is Joel. What you'll notice with Joel, who's the number 4 in white here, is a very, very different type of player. So the FT3s are minimally affected. So if you go and watch a player, you might not recognize that Joel has cerebral palsy, but you might potentially see it more easily in someone like Jack, because you might see that the limb is held, or that they've got more of a pronounced limp when they're tired, or that they might not have a heel strike. Now, as Joel fatigues, you can start to see some of the characteristic traits that we see, especially with the arm holding. But in terms of CP football, you do not need to be affected necessarily in one or more limbs. It can be in any limb. So in terms of Joel, he's relatively unaffected in his legs. But you can notice that that right arm doesn't move as freely as the left-hand side does. So Joel would be a minimally impaired athlete. He would be one that would be more restricted in terms of the opportunity of squad selection, simply because of the international classification rules. So that gives you just a bit of an idea in terms of what an FT1 may look like, what an FT3 looks like, but you are not expected to know that they are in those groups. All we're looking for is, does a player have a limp? Does the player hold their arm in a slightly unusual position? Does it get more pronounced as they get tired? If you look for those 3 characteristics, then you might then get some indicator around whether or not a player has cerebral palsy or not. Deaf football. So we've looked at Will from the previous video. Deaf football, the classification process here is 55 decibels of hearing loss or less in the better ear. And I mean, what we look at is we have audiograms which look at whether or not a player classifies according to the audiogram across 500, 1000 and 2000 hertz. And then we'll go on to showing you what those look like in a moment. Partially sighted, we've touched upon with the blind. Power chair have 3 classifications, so what they call PF1, PF2 and then NE. NE is quite easy, it's not eligible. And then for PF1 and PF2s, again, classification is based upon how the individual is affected and how they are able to move their electric wheelchair in respect of the game. Again, there's various classification eligibility criteria as far as the game format is concerned, which is why we need to know who might have more dexterity, for instance, compared to another player when they're moving their chair around the court. So to give you an idea of an audiogram, this is what an audiogram looks like. So on this one, for instance, what you can see is that the threshold for normal hearing is that top dotted line, which is between, so you've got 0 and then down to sort of 30 decibels. That's normal sort of hearing range, really. And then you'll then see a series of markings in X's and X's and O's. That just indicates left and right ear. And what we're looking for is a recording of 500, 1000 and 2000 hertz that falls below this 55 mark line. So you can see that the scores for this particular individual all fall below that 55 decibels. So i.e. they need increased sound to be able to recognize it. So in this instance, this player would be eligible for the pathway. Different example for you. Again, this is a player who's been in the pathway from before. The key bits we're looking for are 500, 1000 and 2000. And you can see that the scores on both the left and the right ear are very close to that 0 mark. They don't fall below that 55 decibel threshold line. So this individual, because it's not below here, because it's above and closer to 0, they would not be eligible. Now, if you saw an individual with an audiogram like this, would you say that they are eligible or not eligible? What do you reckon? So there's 500, there's 1000, and there's 2000 hertz. Is this individual eligible or not for the pathway? What do you reckon?
Not.
Not eligible?
Not.
Common agreement on that from everyone? I'm getting a couple of nods of heads. So in this instance, this player would not be eligible. However, what you don't know is that this player, when they had the audiogram done, had it with their hearing aids in. So sometimes audiograms aren't always what they may appear. And this is why we say don't worry about the classification side, because it is a real minefield. So because this player has had hearing aids in when he's had the report done, he is eligible for the pathway, because if he's scoring that with his hearing aids, then he would be significantly below if he took his hearing aids out. So if you ever see an audiogram, don't be surprised if you see X's and O's or blues and reds, some form of delineation like this, which indicates the 2 ears. What you're looking at then for is 3 markings and then the 55 decibel range. And if you see something like that, then you might potentially get an idea of whether an individual could be eligible or not for the pathway. But as I say, do not worry about eligibility and classification. That's much more important as we go through to the top end of the spectrum. But it's important to build up that information as we kind of go through to help us with understanding whether or not someone bringing them into something like a regional or national immersion talent program, they may be eligible or not, because we don't want to build up their hopes if we're not able to, and equally we want to put them into the right environment when we can. So very quickly, just to run you through each of the various different impairment-specific formats of the game, as a bit of a visual representation. There's a lot of information on here. The key things to look at on all the next few slides are just going to be what you see in the boxes along the top. So in terms of amputee football, it's played as a 7v7 game format with unlimited substitutions. They play 2 halves of 25 minutes with no offside. The pitch is generally smaller, with smaller goals compared to what you'd be used to with the 11v11 game format. Slide tackles are not allowed in the game. Equally, if the ball hits the crutch of one of the outfield players, that's considered to be handball, because it's an extension of the arm. Equally, goalkeepers are not allowed to save the ball with their stump. And again, the reason for this is partly due to safety, because there's less surface area of skin over the stump. So it's a safety aspect as much as it is a game condition in that respect. But the game is modified and adapted to the needs of the players. So what we're trying to do is offer an opportunity for those with an amputation to be able to play the game in a format that is conducive to their needs. So i.e. going around on crutches. If you've ever been on crutches, they hurt like hell after you've been on them for a while. Imagine what they're like when you're going around and playing a game of football on them. So it's just recognising that there's a different game format for you to be able to use for amputee football. It's the same if we move on to blind football. So blind football, if you watch, well, I was going to say the Paralympics next year or in previous years, this is also known as five-a-side football by the IPC. They play 2 halves of 20 minutes. The goalkeepers have a very small restricted area in front of the goal, which they're not allowed out of. The ball has, contrary to common mythology, it's not a bell that's inside the ball. It's actually ball bearings and shards inside little sound pockets. So it makes a rattle as it moves across the surface. And what you'll find is that it's a very quiet game as well from the spectators, because the players need to be able to hear the ball. You'll also recognise that there are boards that run the length of the touchlines. The idea is twofold. One, it's a reference point for players, so they can feel the extremities of the field of play. And secondly, it keeps the ball in play a lot longer as well. Because, and we'll show you some blind football footage towards the end of this workshop, so you get a feel for that as well. But what we're trying to do is, again, make the game appropriate for blind footballers so they can conducively play in a format that's relevant for them. Cerebral palsy football is also 7v7. The laws of the game are based predominantly upon the FIFA laws. Again, the smaller pitches, smaller goals, no offside. One of the big considerations here is that we have roll-ins as well as throw-ins. So if you're working with a player who has cerebral palsy and they struggle to hold the ball on one side rather than trying to hold it, they can roll it in with their unaffected arm instead. And again, there's regulations in relation to the number of FT1s, FT2s, FT3s you can have on the pitch to try and make it a level playing field for that particular impairment group as well. So you have to have a minimum of 2 FT1s, so the most impaired, and you're allowed a maximum of 1 FT3, so the minimally impaired player, to provide that more level playing field for CP football. Deaf football is probably the easiest one of the lot. That's played at 11v11, has previously also been played as futsal. Again, the eligibility in terms of 55 decibel minimum, which we looked at on the audiograms before. The only variation you'll probably see is that the official in the middle will have some form of visual aids, whether it's a flag or a bib, just to kind of help with attracting attention of the players in case they blow the whistle. At the international level, players cannot wear hearing aids or cochlear implants or any form of corrective device. So they have to play with what would be considered to be their natural hearing level. So they're not allowed to use corrective materials. But in the pathway, we wouldn't necessarily expect that for the younger stage groups. We look to build into it and help support that individual with getting used to not having their cochlear implants switched on or inserted. Partially sighted players, we have a futsal, essentially the futsal format of the game, 2 20-minute halves with stop clock. The only slight variations we have in partially sighted futsal is that the goalkeeper distribution has to bounce inside of our own half before it can go over halfway. Unlike in futsal, where you can essentially launch it into the opposition half in that respect. But aside from that, there's not much variation in terms of how we play. And you probably saw that with the international footage from that I showed you at the very start. It's a very quick, very fast-paced game, very technically skillful, based around the futsal format of the game under FIFA laws. And then the final one is power chair football. So this is a 4 versus 4 format of the game, played on effectively 2 badminton courts. 2 20-minute halves. The football that's used is much larger. So as you can see on the image there, the ball will hit the bumpers that are on the front of the wheelchair. And we have a rule in power chair football which is called 2-on-1 rather than offside. So 2-on-1 effectively means you cannot have you plus a teammate go and challenge an opponent for the ball. So it has to be 1 versus 1. The only slight exception to that is that the goalkeeper is excluded, but I don't want to confuse things too much. Effectively, what you just need to know on that particular law variation is that you should only be going up 1 versus 1 against an opponent. All the players will be involved in the game using electric or power chair, not manual chair in that respect. Any questions or concerns on that? Hope that gives you a bit of a feel and a bit of a flavour for the for how the game looks and works at each different impairment group.
Can I just ask, why is this 4v4 and not 5v5?
Yep. So there's a number of considerations around it. One is to do with the size of the area. So, for instance, if you play on a much larger area, then you then need more players. Part of the challenge is the expense associated with the game. So, i.e. needing to have the chair, needing to have the bumper. So 4v4 is an easier format to be able to operate on a financial level, easier to operate in respect of player numbers as well, and also easier to allow integration from the respect of how the game can be. It's not if you have a really big futsal hall, for instance, then you might struggle to be able to fit 5v5 on. 3v3 might be too few. So 4v4 is a kind of a bit of a mix and a medium between taking the 5v5 format and just making it slightly more applicable for the considerations that we have with power chair players.
Okay.
Antonio, so cognitive, so learning impairment. So so I mentioned at the start that the first squad I got involved with was with cognitive or learning impairment or learning disability groups. Currently, there is no international recognised format for learning disabled or learning difficulty classified players. So we at the moment with the FA operate squads where there is a recognised international format. What we do for those who have a learning impairment or a learning difficulty, though, is support them into their local pan disability team. If they feel that that's too easy for them, then we signpost them and direct them into their local mainstream club. So the opportunities for them currently sit at grassroots, but then they can then move through the mainstream pathway up through the player pyramid towards semi-professional and potentially professional game formats. There have been players in the past who have played for the England senior men's team who would and have classified for the England learning disability squads. And the purpose of running a specific format outside of those offered through the men's and the women's sections, i.e. power chair, blind, CP, is that we offer an alternative format where a player cannot access the mainstream pathway. So for instance, power chair footballers cannot access the mainstream 11v11 pathway because there's additional considerations that go in around it. Learning disability players can and have in the past played professional football. So therefore the opportunity for them to play at senior level as well as England C level, if they're playing in the semi-pro realms, is equally sort of pertinent and considerate in that respect. So we don't operate a learning disability squad because players have the opportunity to go and play for England through the mainstream pathway avenues. Having said that, MenCap and Special Olympics do operate activities for those with more severe learning disabilities and learning difficulties. So there is opportunity still for those players to access the game through those mediums as well as through the FA specific formats as well. I hope that answers your question, Antonio. If not, then please let me know.
It's a bit of a shame though, John, isn't it? Because Downs and autism and all of that sort of thing. I mean, how many people actually succeed if you're autistic or if you're Downs in mainstream football?
Yeah, so this is, again, where we come back into supporting individuals through MenCap and Special Olympics to be able to access things like the Special Olympics. So there is alternative ways that players can access international level competition outside of what's offered through either the wider footballing family, so whether that's FIFA, UEFA, and then equally also with respect to impairment-specific organisations. So there is an international learning disability association, but they don't have football as one of the current offers at that level. So we can operate an England team, but if there's nowhere for them to be able to play and compete against, then it's really difficult to justify running that. And it's the same thing with Antonio's point around Down syndrome.
Yeah.
The problem with Down syndrome is that there is no international recognised pathway at the moment. There are steps being taken towards that, and obviously everything's always under review. But with Down syndrome, just to answer your point specifically, Antonio, it's the same situation as a learning disability group. There is no recognised international pathway at the moment, although there are some more exhibition-related formats which currently are in experimentation to kind of see whether or not something could go. And ultimately, if there's a need for it and there's an opportunity to run something, then the FA will always look at operating groups. It's just the ones that currently operate are the ones that we have squads for.
Okay, thank you.
No problem at all. So we're nearly at the end, and I haven't got much more left to necessarily kind of run through. Just in respect of this, I'm going to show you a different players. This is Connor Rawlings. So he's an FT2 player. again, just have a look at him on so I've got some a short bit of footage for you to have a look at. And whilst you're watching it, just consider sort of those 3 questions. How would you rate his potential? So where would you put him in the system currently? Would you put him at Talent Hub? Would you put him at regional level? Would you put him at national level? Would you put him under 21s or senior squad? Any particular considerations that you see in relation to what you might pick out? So this is Connor on the ball now. So just have a watch of him and then let me know where you think he might fit in on the pathway. Again, you'll recognise that as an FT2, he sits between the most severe end and the most minimally impaired. So you can see that he's affected on that right side because he's got quite a stiff right arm. And now you can see that more pronounced limp, the lack of a heel strike coming in on that right foot as he's walking. And then as the run comes in, it tends to disappear a little bit. So really short bit of clip of footage. Where would you put him in the pathway and why? Would you go Talent Hub? Would you go regional program? Would you go national program? Would you go under 21s or would you go senior and why?
But again, really tricky. You know the answer, but it's really tricky from that little clip because that little the clip we watch is sort of juddering a bit. But I mean, he's got to be somewhere in national emerging talent, hasn't he? And I'm not sure how old he is.
So yeah, so Connor is 16.
So he'd be 16 to 19 then, wouldn't he? National emerging talent, 16 to 19.
Yeah, he would, and he is. But why would you put him in that particular grouping?
Well, because again, if you look at it, and it's very, again, difficult to tell, but if you look at his ability there, and you look at everything that he's got there in terms of the agility, the speed, the control, the awareness, all of that sort of thing, he seems to have it.
Yep. So for you, it's around those technical and tactical competencies that you're looking at over the physical ones. Yeah,
because I can't really see the physical ones, you know, in terms of the clip.
Yep. So Connor is in our National Immersion Talent Programme. He's been around for a couple of seasons now. He's moved through from Talent Hub into regional and international. He probably will make the breakthrough into the under 21 group this season as well, even though he's young, because he's technically coming on very, very quickly in that respect. But the important thing from my perspective here really is to get you thinking around where would you put a player if you saw a player, and more importantly, what's the reason why you think that they would go in that particular level, as it were, within the pathway. So, and this sort of slide here comes back onto what Connor mentioned from before. So there is going to be a handout that Connor and Lauren are going to pass on to you, which has this in more detail within it. So don't worry about it. I know it's very small on the screen. I've just literally lifted it all out. What we're trying to demonstrate for you here, more than anything else, is the process by which a player would get referred. And again, it touches on what we spoke about on Connor's question from earlier on. So we'd have a look at getting some information in. So the referral is passed on to the talent identification lead. We check the eligibility in terms of the player, so whether or not they fit within the international criteria. And then we would then, if they're not eligible, look to refer to a local playing opportunity, which is that red side you can see. On the green side, what we would have here is that if the player is eligible, we then look to signpost them to an existing program. If we can do that, then we would identify and move them straight in, so straight into a talent hub process or a regional program, whatever it may be, with regular monitoring. If we cannot put them into an existing entry program because something isn't running, for instance, then that's where we then deploy one of the local scouts. So if, for instance, you're age 24, 25, there isn't an entry program in the respect of a talent pathway like there is with younger groups. So that's where we would then put a local scout out to go and watch, collate the relevant information, and then refer on from there to the appropriate level of the pathway in conversation with the talent pathway manager and also the national classification manager as well. So that just kind of reinforces, I suppose, what we spoke on before in relation to that referral process, more than anything else in that consideration. So as I say, have a look at it from the point of the resource when it comes out, but it will explain a little bit more for you when you see it. So this isn't necessarily something I want you to answer right now, but it's more around thinking of the programs, the initiatives, or the people who you are involved with, and how can you start to think around interacting and putting them into the know of what the opportunities are within the talent pathway in that respect. So what we're trying to do tonight is give you some perspective of what the pathway looks like, give you some understanding about how players and coaches might be able to enter into that, give you some knowledge of the potential classification and eligibility routes, but think around who do you already know, or who can you pass information on to who can help with bringing that player potentially into another format of the game that they might not be aware of from before, and maybe give them a chance to go on and represent the Three Lions at an international competition, because there's always that dual pathway open to players, and we're always insistent that players need to be playing for their local club. That's the primary way that they will be spotted, the primary way they will develop, and the primary way that they will progress. So I'm just going to finish off with a quick example of blind football. So this is some example footage. I won't play you all of this, but this is an example of the blind team from a couple of years ago, to give you an example around what the blind game looks like. And again, don't worry too much in relation to trying to classify. It's more around just getting a feel for what the game looks like when you're actually seeing a blind game or a blind footballer. So I'll let you have a little watch the footage for a few moments. That yellow box, you can see the goalkeeper is in there, not the semicircle. That yellow box is that restricted area we're talking about for the goalkeeper. You'll notice that all the outfield players have got a pair of shades or blindfold on. Again, that provides continuity as far as eligibility is concerned, and a level playing field for players. So that's a standard process for all groups. You can see the boards that run along the length of the field of play as well. And you can see the pace at which they move as well, despite the fact that they're wearing a blindfold. So that's what it looks like at the England level. And then to kind of give you an alternative end of the spectrum, this is you might have seen Mikey's story promoted on various media channels. Mikey is a very young player. When I say young, the clip that we've got from here was when he was about 8 or 9. He's now 10, 11 years old. But this is what potentially a really amazingly talented young blind footballer can look like.
Good. Quicker turn, quicker. Good. Good feet, good feet. Oh.
And there you can hear the rattle of the ball as well as he's playing. Now, Mikey is an exception in terms of the blind younger pathway, because he is well in advance of where we'd expect him to be. But to get players to that level in some cases takes many, many years in that respect. So if you think you've come across a blind player, then the key thing to just work out is the same as what we would do for a partially sighted player or a CP player. Find out what their eligibility may be in terms of what level of sight they've got, and then find out if they know anything in terms of the blind game or the partially sighted game. But again, international level, grassroots level, there's opportunities there for players. And if you come across a blind player, let us know straight away and we can get the dedicated support in for them as and where needed. Aside from that, That's everything in terms of the sort of the content that I'm going to share with you this evening. As I say, there is a resource that we'll make available to you afterwards. And if you want to pick up any particular conversations, then obviously we can do that at the same time. Happy to answer any quick questions that might be in the offing at the moment. Otherwise, thank you for attending. Thank you for your engagement and listening. I hope it's given you something to take away and have a look at once we get back into football over the next few months.
John, that was brilliant as usual. Thanks a million. Thanks for giving your time tonight and coming on and really going through it and really good detail tonight as well. So is there any more questions anybody would like to ask just before we finish up?
I've just got one question.
Please do, go ahead.
How do we as coaches then get to see a coaching session, right, at one of these hubs?
It's a really good question. Yeah, it's a really good question. So in terms of the hubs, where do you live, sir?
So I'm in the Richmond area. So I note that there's a place in Hampton.
Correct, yes. So yeah, when the programs get back up and running again, so we've got a number of programs that run across London. So there is one that runs at Hampton School. If you wanted to come and have a look at the activities that are taking place, equally with something like the regional program as well, if you drop a line into, it's probably going to be, I reckon, you, Lauren. Yeah. I imagine. Okay. If you drop a line into Lauren, we can then pick up and coordinate that and allow you to come and have a look, get a feel for what the environment's like, see what the coaching's like, see what the players are like, and then build up your knowledge that way. So you're very welcome to be able to do that.
Thank you very much, John. Yeah,
no problem at all. Yep, same for you, Antonio. If you wanted to come and have a look and see, then feel free to drop a line through to us. We can coordinate that. Again, there's programs that are in North, West, South and East London, so spread across the capital in that respect. So if you want to come and have a look, once hopefully things are up and running in 2021, then let us know. We can certainly look at facilitating that for you so you can see.
Brilliant.
Right, is there any other questions? No? Yeah, John, I think obviously that was a lot of detail, so I can't imagine there would be too many questions. But yeah, I mean, if you've got any other questions kind of after this, any afterthoughts, give any of us an email, and then yeah, we can get the information out to you. And yeah, we'll send out the resources that John's mentioned as well. But if that's everything, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much, John, for going through that as well. The session's going to be recorded, so if you kind of forget any information, it'll be kind of up on, I think, on our YouTube channel, so you can kind of refer back to that. So cool. All right, well, thanks everybody. Have a lovely rest of your evening, and hopefully I'll see some of you guys coaching